Okay, so 339-301, we've got 339-206. A history of a a history of a particular medical problem may be the basis of a medical disqualification only if the condition at issue is itself disqualifying, recurrence cannot medically be ruled out, and the duties of the position are such that a recurrence would pose a reasonable probability of substantial harm. That's the standard in the federal system. It's very, very different than under state law, or very, very different in the standard of practice for fitness for duty evaluations. It's the federal system. So you need to be sure that in whatever jurisdiction you're working, you need to know if there are any statutory or policy or regulatory directives that would paint the contours of the forensic question and the definition of fitness, or in the case of this, direct threat. So here's the federal standard for direct threat. This comes from a case of Lassiter versus Reno, as in Janet Reno. Given the duties of a deputy marshal, a significant risk to the safety of others can arise not only from an inclination to strike out in violence, but also from a tendency to misperceive the true nature of events. Placed in unfamiliar circumstances that may or may not be hostile, the deputy marshal must have the ability to decide in an instant whether the use of deadly force is warranted. If an innocent person is injured or killed because a deputy marshal read threatening meanings into benign remarks or events, it is not difficult to imagine the public outrage, let alone the potential liability to which the federal government would be subjected. This is a case involving a paranoid deputy marshal. Now, the relevance of this, you'll see in a moment, but let me just kind of skip ahead a little bit, is that the federal standard in ADA is that a direct threat means a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. Significant risk of substantial harm. That is further defined by the EEOC as significant risk means highly probable, not simply more likely. So 51%, is that high? More likely? They haven't defined it. But it is highly probable, is what the EEOC says. Now, under the interpretation of Lassiter, that is further clarified, as you'll see here in a second. In assessing whether an employee can perform his duties without significant risk to the safety of himself or others, we must consider the nature of the position and the consequences should the employee fail to perform his duties properly. Now the question is being constructed in such a way that it's not a matter of across the board of whether the person's behavior is highly probable to cause substantial harm to others, but it's an interaction between their particular problems and the nature of the job. What case did that sound like? Remember EEOC versus Amigo. Cody as well. Brownfield versus Yakima, where the court said, you know, we normally wouldn't refer a person for fitness for duty evaluation unless there was some impaired performance on the job. But in the case of a police officer, we don't want to wait for their performance to fall apart when we have non-performance data that suggests we may very well get to that point. So a preemptive fitness for duty evaluation was called for in the case of a public safety employee. Here again, the courts are saying, let's not be held to this highly probable definition of direct threat when we're talking about a police officer. So, yes?
So for you, do you then differentiate between a fitness and a threat assessment? evaluation?
Do I differentiate between what, Jocelyn?
Using the terms of a fitness for duty or a threat assessment or a risk assessment, or is it really?
Question is,
all
do I
in one?
differentiate between a fitness for duty evaluation or a threat assessment or a risk assessment?
In an employment situation?
I differentiate in this respect. Certainly those terms are often used by an agency. I don't force them to adopt my language. I accept their language. It is still a compulsory medical evaluation, and I'm happy to use their terms, but all of the protections, all of the procedures that I would follow regardless of what language they use. If it's a compulsory medical evaluation of an incumbent employee, it is going to be the same procedures. I'm going to follow the same methodology, but I'm going to use their language, and it defines the scope, pardon me, it defines the scope of the forensic question. If it's a threat assessment, I'm not assessing whether or not they can perform the essential functions of their job effectively. I'm only trying to determine whether or not they pose a risk to themselves or others. So the forensic question changes. I'm not going to do a fitness for duty evaluation that focuses on broadly on can they perform the essential functions of their job, when the only question posed to me by the employer is whether they pose a substantial threat to others in the workplace.